Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Harborne Islamic Studies Circle HISC Seerah sessions, 112 this time. The 10th session we're doing on the Battle of Uhud. Probably not the last one. Last one, inshallah, will be next week after Eid, inshallah. But last time, what we covered in Battle of Uhud was essentially the burial of the martyrs, and then some of the stories of the burial scenes, and how strong some of the ladies were when they heard of the death of their loved ones. We also talked about the rites and the rules of burial, and the fact that we shouldn't, even to this day, consider the shaheed at Uhud to be dead, but know that Allah says that they are in paradise. We should also remember how the Prophet ﷺ was advised that vengeance is not, because he said when he saw the mutilation of Hamza, that he would do something like that to 30 of them, and then Allah corrected him and said, look, vengeance should be of equal proportions, but it's better to forgive. And then linked to that was the absolute prohibition of mutilating of the dead bodies. Then also we talked about the levels of grief of some of the ladies and the wailing, and then later on how the sort of public wailing was prohibited, and the fact that the Prophet ﷺ and the Muslims managed to capture one prisoner of war, Abu Azza, and he was the one who broken his promise after he was captured in Badr, came back to fight, and then he was dealt with as a prisoner of war. And then we talked about, once they'd done all of that, how the Muslims and Muslim army, they returned, once they buried everyone in Uhud, where they were slain, they returned to Medina, and Prophet ﷺ sent Ali out to check the roads in, make sure that the Quraish don't double back and attack the Muslims. And then in addition to that, the Muslims, they were guarding all the entrances and exits to the city. So sort of linked to that is what's called Hamra-ul Asad, which is a ghazwa where the Prophet ﷺ actually went out, but talk about that in a second. But just to sort of recap, in as far as most of the narrations that we've got confirm that there were about 70 Muslims who were shaheed on the day of Uhud. The vast majority, 65 or so, were from the Ansar, of which it's recorded 41 are from the Khazraj, 24 from the Aus. In addition to these 65, there was one of the Jews, the Mukhayrik, and 4 of the Muhajir. And the 2 most prominent people we've discussed were obviously Hamza ibn Abdul Muttalib and Musa ibn Umair. So that's about 70. And again, we talk about how this number 70 seems to crop up a lot, and it could signify there were just an awful lot of people. So 70 were killed on Uhud and buried. As far as the mushrikeen, it said that 22 of them were killed, but other versions say about 37 of them were killed. And then we've heard stories of how individual gallantry from some of the Muslims, certainly in the first phase of the battle, would imply that there may be a higher death toll and casualty toll amongst the mushriks. But nevertheless, moving on. So the Prophet ﷺ then he's returned back to his home, taken off his armor. He sent out Ali in a small group, sort of reconnaissance, and just to make sure that they don't get caught unawares. And then the Quraish, they're also disputing amongst themselves what they need to do. But anyway, we'll come on to that in a second. what we found is that the Prophet the next morning, he then made an announcement that because of the uncertainty, and possibly because of further intel he's received, we don't know, but because of the uncertainty, that they will send out, or they will go out and camp out and defend Medina should the need be. And only those who were only those who participated in Uhud would be able to join those people, because as we said, Ali ibn Abi Talib, he's already been sent out with about 70 of the others, even though they'd been fighting for the whole day, come back really tired and shattered and exhausted. Yet Ali and 70 others, they went out, and they're this advanced party protecting Medina. And Allah refers to this in the Qur'an, Surah Al-Imran, where he says, and those, in translation, those who responded to Allah and His Messenger after they were wounded. So the Prophet ﷺ, again, he's had the night to mull over things. The next day, what happens is that the Prophet ﷺ, he's determined to go out and pursue the Meccan army, and to show the Muslim strength, the fact that they haven't been defeated. And again, this is really good posturing and a way of increasing the morale of the Muslims, as well as specifically defending the honor of the Muslims should the Quraysh decide to double back. So the Sunday morning, the 8th of Shawwal, and some say it's the 15th of Shawwal, the Prophet says, nobody will march with me except those who've already participated in Uhud. But here you got Abdullah ibn Ubay, the chief of the hypocrites, saying, no, I will march out with you. So if we recall back how the day before Abdullah had marched out 1,000 strong, and then he kept back his 300 as they were marching out, and that was specifically designed to demoralize the Muslims, cause them to fight amongst themselves, and to morally defeat them before battle. So this was a specific trick that he had orchestrated, and this was something that was planned in advance. But for this fight, he jumps and says, I'm happy to come out and defend alongside the Prophet ﷺ, probably because he knew there wouldn't be any fighting, and probably just to save some face. But the Prophet ﷺ says no, only those. He reiterated, only those who fought in Uhud are able to join me. The one exception was Jabir bin Abdullah, who came to the Prophet ﷺ, and he sort of begged him that to allow him to accompany the Prophet ﷺ on Hamra-ul Asad, because he'd always wanted to fight alongside the Prophet ﷺ, and he was stopped from going and joining Uhud because his father, and we talked about this, his father had specifically asked Jabir to stay back and look after his sisters. But so the Prophet made the exception for Jabir to accompany them. So the Muslims, many of them who had fought the day before, marched out until they reached this place called Hamra-ul Asad, which is about 8 miles from Medina. And this is on the main road outside. So they camped there, and obviously were joined or took Ali and his contingent alongside with them. Whilst they're there, they're joined by someone called Ma'bad ibn Abi Ma'bad. So Ma'bad, he came to the Prophet ﷺ. He came looking for the Prophet ﷺ, and wanted to specifically speak to him about the issues at Uhud. Now there's some it's not clear whether he was actually a Muslim or not. Some say he converted at this time. Some say he became a Muslim later on. Some say he remained a pagan. But Ma'bad, his tribe was the Khuza'ah tribe, and they had a very strong link with Banu Hashim, and he was embarrassed by how the Quraish had pursued the Prophet ﷺ, and come to Medina. So, and he knew clearly that the Quraysh were in the wrong. So he came to the Prophet and says, "O Muhammad, by Allah, we feel great sorrow for what happened to you and your companions, and we really hope that you're not going to suffer again." And then he goes, "Well, I would rather the other group were inflicted." Essentially saying, you took a bit of a beating, but but from his point of view, he would have preferred the other group to be the ones who took the heavy toll. So they had a short conversation, and the Prophet ﷺ, some versions say he suggested to Ma'bad ibn Abi Ma'bad to go and overtake Abu Sufyan, to basically find out where Abu Sufyan is, go pursue him in that direction, and to discourage him from coming back and attacking the Muslims. So again, the Prophet ﷺ, he had this in his mind that maybe the Quraysh will come back for round 2 of Uhud, and this was well borne out, because the Quraysh, they'd left obviously the day before. They'd been marching, and then they'd settled at a place called Al-Raha, which is about 36 miles or so from Medina, so much further away. So once they're camped there the next day, they start arguing amongst themselves, and they're saying basically, we did nothing. One prominent group amongst them was accusing them, said, "Look, you guys did nothing. You broke down their force, but then you left them." And there are some distinguished men amongst them who will probably gather up people to fight you again. So let's go back and annihilate them and crush them now. Essentially saying, look, we didn't finish the job. We left too hastily. We had the upper hand. We should have finished it off. Because if we leave them, they're going to come back at us. So that sort of prominent group amongst the mushrikeen, and again, it's 3,000 strong. They started sort of being swayed by that argument, saying, look, we really need to do something. We haven't really achieved our objectives. So one of the prominent leaders of the Quraysh at the time, he is known as Safwan ibn Umayyah. So Safwan, he turns around and he says, he tries to dissuade these people from fighting. He basically says, "Oh people, do not do such a thing, for I fear that the Prophet or he will gather up those who stayed behind and did not share in Uhud, and then they will start and attack us, and then they'll go back as winners. For I'm not sure of what turn will the consequences be if we get involved in another fight. We should just turn back and claim the victory as it is, and it might be your prejudice in the final place." So essentially, what Safwan, who's quite a senior mushrik, and one of the prominent mushrikeen who's travelled a lot, one of the elder wise spokespeople for them, he's basically saying, look, I wouldn't go back and fight. I think it's a bad idea, because these guys, they're going to come back and fight even harder now. They'll want revenge. Plus, we've essentially got the upper hand. We've won. Let's take that victory and fight another day. So then Ikramah ibn Abi Jahl, he's one of those prominent people who's just basically saying, look, no way, look, we didn't do what we came out to do. Neither have we killed Muhammad, nor have we done anything to gain any real honor. So, he's basically saying, look, we haven't met our objectives. This is folly, essentially. Let's go back and let's finish the job. Now, as they're arguing amongst themselves in Roha, what happens is that Ma'bad ibn Abi Ma'bad, he comes and he meets up with them. So when he gets there, he's got that news from Prophet ﷺ to try and dissuade them. So that's what he tries to do. So they ask him, what news do you have? Where have you come from? And he explains he's coming from Medina, and then he paints a picture of the Muslims being quite angry and ferocious and quite vengeful. So he says, Muhammad has marched out to meet you with a large host of fighters, and I've never seen anything like it before. He's gathered all the troops and even those who didn't fight in Uhud, and they surely regret the fact that they missed out, and they want to compensate for it now. Their hearts are filled with hate and resentment. So he's basically saying, look, these guys, even those who weren't, and the mushrikeen, they recognize that only 700 of them were there. Now what Ma'bad is saying, look, they've got a much larger contingent. Everyone wants revenge, and they've got sort of blood in their eyes. They really out to get you. So they're going to fight quite ferociously. So Abu Sufyan, he says to them, he's sort of panicking. He's got Ikrimah on one side, he's got Ma'bad here. He goes, woe to you, what do you suggest? So Ma'bad says, by Allah, I see that you would not leave till he comes and you see the heads of their horses, or till the vanguard of his army turns up from behind that hill. So essentially saying, look, they're rushing out and they're going to be here any moment. They are out for revenge. So then Abu Sufyan, he gathers the leaders and says, look, by Allah, we've reached a common consent that we're going to go back and we're going to crush the Muslims and their power. So they'd agreed that actually they need to go back and finish the job, and they were focused on that particular outcome. So then Ma'bad, he implores them again and says, look, I advise you not to do that. So Abu Sufyan says, look, we've already made the decision, but he's ramping up his advice and says, flee away with your horses as fast as you can. So Abu Sufyan, he doesn't know that Ma'bad's already spoken to Prophet ﷺ, but Ma'bad's essentially saying what Safwan ibn Umayyah said, look, this is going to be a much tougher battle now. So then, because of that, panic takes hold in a large section of the Quraish army, and they get demoralized, and then they think, well, it's better then to withdraw back to Mecca. So they're on their way back to Mecca. Then they need to give the impression that they might still come back and fight. So a really cat and mouse game between Muslims and the Quraysh. They sort of start their own propaganda campaign. They come across a caravan belonging to Abu Qais, who's on his way to Medina, and then Abu Sufyan, he basically says to him, tell them, carry this message to the Muslims in Medina that the people of Mecca, they've rallied their ranks, and they're going to come back and they're going to try to annihilate the Muslims, the Prophet and his companions. And in return, Abu Sufyan said, I'm going to give you a caravan full of raisins, or a load of raisins, in the form of uqaz the following year. So the people of the caravan of Qais, they head to Medina, and then they arrive outside Medina where the Prophet is camped at Hamra-ul Asad, and they say this is what they're planning. They're planning to attack you. So again, they're trying to outdo each other. This psychological warfare, the psych-ops that we talk about nowadays. Then these words from Abu Sufyan through Abd Qais, they have no effect on the strong Muslims, and Allah refers to this in the Qur'an, again in Surah Al-Imran, where he says in translation, and they said, Allah alone is sufficient for us, He is the best disposer of affairs for us. So they turned with grace and bounty from Allah. No harm touched them, and they followed the good pleasure of Allah, and Allah is the owner of great bounty. Now, the other thing that happened, the very final element of the Battle of Uhud, is there's a Meccan spy called Muawiyah bin al-Mughira bin Abi al-As, who was essentially sentenced to death. Now, this spy, he was the grandfather of Abdul Malik bin Marwan on his mother's side, and when the Quraish they went back after Uhud, Muawiyah, he came to his paternal cousin Uthman ibn Affan. So he came to visit Uthman, and Uthman gave him shelter after securing a specific exemption and permission from the Prophet ﷺ. But the condition was that Muawiyah could stay for those 3 days only, and he has to go back after 3 days. If he's caught in Medina after 3 days, he would be killed. So the Prophet ﷺ, he's marched out the next day. He camped at Hamra-ul Asad for 3 days. Nothing happened. The Quraysh didn't come back. Full army was there in preparation for that. And then the Prophet ﷺ and the army, they return after 3 days, and they find Muawiyah still there, and he's essentially conducting spying operations for the Quraysh. So he's stayed his welcome. He's going around the streets spying for the Quraysh, and so then when he sees that the Muslims have come back, the Prophet he flees. So he goes out of Medina. He runs away, and then the Prophet he orders Zayd bin Haritha and Amr bin al-Yasir to pursue him, catch him, and kill him, which is essentially what they did. So some scholars, they refer to Hamra-ul Asad as a separate battle, as a Khuza'ah, because the Prophet he was in charge of the battle, the army, the Muslim army. Others consider Hamra-ul Asad as essentially just being an extension of Uhud, because it's essentially linked to the defense positions following Uhud. So these are the main accounts from the Battle of Uhud. So we've essentially finished the sort of historical chronological elements of Uhud, alhamdulillah. But there is a lot to learn from the Battle of Uhud, and certainly for the remainder of this session, the next 15-20 minutes, inshallah, as well as probably next week's session, we'll be going through the lessons from the Battle of Uhud. What can we learn? We'll also compare Uhud with the Battle of Badr, and also what the Qur'an says about the Battle of Uhud. And again, there are about 60 verses in the Qur'an and in Surah Al-Imran that refer directly to the Battle of Uhud. So, going, previously, after the Battle of Badr, Surah Al-Anfal was revealed. Here you've got lots of verses relating to Uhud in Surah Al-Imran, which is the third surah of the Qur'an, Al-Imran. So Anfal for Badr, and Al-Imran, verses of them for the lessons from Uhud. But before we get on to that, question that's often asked, and I know my kids ask me that as well, is Badr was undoubtedly a monumental victory for the Muslims, no doubt about that. But was Uhud a victory or a loss? And most people would consider it a loss, but there are many arguments that say, well, actually, it may be a loss purely in terms of, men that were lost or demoralization, but actually, it's a victory of sorts. So we'll just sort of go over that and see what sort of spin we can put on that. Is it a victory or a loss? So undoubtedly, the military superiority of the Quraish in phase 2 of the battle meant that they won that portion of the battle without a doubt. Phase 1 of the battle, the Muslims won. They, wiped the floor of the Quraysh army. They fled, and the battlefield was essentially empty. So phase 1, the Muslims won. And then the fatal mistake was the 40 of the 50 archers, they came down from their mount against the express command of the Prophet ﷺ, and Khalid bin Walid took advantage of that, killed all 10 of the remaining archers, and then the rout happened where lots of Muslims, they died in phase 2 of the battle. And then some could argue phase 3 is essentially Hamra-ul Asad, where the defense fortifications post battle. So certainly phase 2 was won by the mushrikeen, but the believers, the Muslims, were defeated there. But phase 1 and phase 3, the Muslims were not defeated at all. And then if you look at in terms of other aspects, what was the goal of the Muslims? What was the goal of the Quraysh? From the Quraysh side, the Meccan side, they failed to even occupy the camp of the Muslims. Yes, they routed the Muslims in phase 2, and they chased after the Muslims, and the Muslims retreated, but they didn't take over the camp of the Muslims. The Muslims were still able to protect themselves. The greater bulk of the Muslim army, notwithstanding the chaos and confusion amongst the ranks of the Muslim army, they did not run or escape. On the contrary, a large bulk of the Muslim army, they stayed back and they showed matchless heroism, resistance, and defense of the Muslims. So they managed to gather back around their own headquarters and fight and defend the Prophet ﷺ. So in some military terms, they can't be seen as having been defeated there. And linked to that, they didn't allow the Quraysh army to run after them in pursuit either, and neither did the mushrikeen pursue the Muslim army. Rather, we saw the fact that it was the Muslim army that marched out the next day in pursuit of the Quraysh. So the Quraysh, they as we said, and they recognized they didn't finish the job. They left it hanging. So it was incomplete, and rather than and they're the ones who actually hastily withdrew from the battlefield, rather than the Muslims hastily withdrawing. Okay, that's another sign of who was actually on top is who stays back on the battlefield. Who full establishes their full victory and authority on the battlefield, and the Quraysh were not able to do that. In addition, there were no Muslims who were taken captive. There were no known spoils of war gained by the Meccan army. So no prisoners of war and no ghanima by the Meccans. And on the other side, we saw that the Muslims had in fact taken a prisoner of war, right? So one prisoner of war of the Quraish that the Muslims took. So again, in that metric, that the Muslims won. Medina in itself, the capital of the Muslims, the Islamic State, it's only a stone's throw away from where the battlefield. Yet, the Quraysh did not feel strong enough or confident enough, despite their overwhelming military superiority in numbers, to storm Medina, or to plunder Medina, or to capture the women and children in Medina. They didn't do that. They didn't think that they were so victorious that they were able to capitalize on their victory, which is what other armies may well have done. If you've comprehensively defeated the military wing of your opponent, you go back and you defeat the civilian wing, as it were, or you capture them, or you take them as slaves. Again, the Quraysh didn't do any of that. They didn't have the guts, or they weren't bold enough to do that, and they recognized that once they left the battlefield. Also, the goal of the Muslims was to defend Medina. And did they do this? Of course they did, right? The Prophet in his own preference, because he did the shura at the beginning of the battle, was to fight from within Medina, but the following shura, the overwhelming opinion was that they should fight outside Medina, and he went along with that. But essentially it was to defend the Muslims, defend the Islamic State, to defend Medina, and the Prophet did that by luring them away from Medina. So the Muslims managed to defend Medina, so they were victorious in that. The goal of the Quraysh was explicit, and that was to kill the Prophet and obliterate the Muslims, and they failed in all of those aspects. They neither obliterated the Muslims, nor did they defeat and kill the Prophet. And moreover, they thought that they would launch a surprise attack against the Muslims. They're the ones that we said who marched out and covered the distance from Mecca to Medina in double quick time. So that they marched out so quickly that they thought that they could take the Muslims by surprise. But the Muslims were in fact prepared for that, because Al-Abbas had tipped off the Muslims, and we know after this Abu Sufyan was suspicious of Al-Abbas and thought he might be the spy in their midst. But there you can see that the objectives of the battle, the Muslims were victorious in their objective, defend Medina, and the Quraysh were not victorious in their objective, which was to kill the Prophet ﷺ and obliterate the Muslims. As we said, again, generally speaking, in that day and age, it's the people, who are left standing who are seen as the victors. So who remained on the battlefield and who left the battlefield early gives an indication. So the Muslims remained on the battlefield, the Quraysh left early. So in that metric, you can see that the Muslims were victorious. And again, the Quraysh were too cowardly to pursue the Muslims in phase 3 of the war. Talk about phase 1, where the Muslims were victorious. Phase 2, the counter-offensive, and then phase 3, the Quraysh were unable to force home their military superiority, their superiority on the battlefield. And if anything, they were the ones who made a quick exit and evacuated the battlefield before the Muslims. So they're the ones who scarpered from the battlefield. So they, you can see that they didn't feel as if they'd won, and they didn't have that post-victory posturing that you'd expect from a victorious army that had vanquished its enemy. They do that, posturing. Just to show, flex their muscles and to show who's the boss. Like the Prophet did post-Badr, he camped there for 3 days, and he showed to his own army and to the enemy and to the people around, that they are clearly the ones who won. So the Muslims, they were the ones who stayed in Hamra-ul Asad for 3 days. They're the ones who prevented any counter-offensive. And then also we've got sort of a wider macro reason. The whole reason for Badr and Uhud as being the revenge for Badr was the fact that the trade routes were threatened by the Muslims, and the Muslims had been very successful in intercepting the trade caravans, certainly those going north from Mecca to Syria. The Muslims had been very successful in that, and so Badr and Uhud was there to put an end to that. Yet we see that Uhud was not able to fulfill even that objective. The issue of the vulnerability of the trade route was still there, and that had not been solved by Uhud. So all of these things you can see, could infer that actually, in a wider, more holistic sense, the Muslims were victorious at Uhud, although they had, more shaheed, and in proportional terms it was huge, the number of deaths they had. But the final point is one that's mentioned by Ibn Qiyam, and this is from the lips of the generals themselves from the Quraish, Ikrimah ibn Abi Jahl, and he says, look, we haven't done anything worthy of praise yet. We killed a few of them, but we've not done the job. What's the point in gloating? We haven't done anything that's worth gloating about. The only thing that the Quraysh done was inflict heavy losses on the Muslims in sort of personnel terms, military terms, but they failed to achieve their ultimate goals of annihilating the Muslims or severely denting the operations of the Muslims or the Muslim state. So as I say, it can be argued that Uhud was actually a victory for the Muslims, and again, it's strange how a victorious army would be so hasty in retreating, right? And then even going back, fearing the Muslims, right? So they retreated quickly, and yet if they were so emboldened by their victory, they would go back and finish the job. Yet they fled in fear and almost disgrace, the next day, right? So they were crippled by this fear of the Muslims. So we need to sort of look at things in a wider context, in a more holistic fashion, to consider whether Uhud was actually a defeat or not. And in fact, the lessons that can be learned just in the Qur'an are so vast with regards to Uhud that many scholars do say that in fact Uhud was a victory. And the amount of things that Allah tells us in the Quran or exposes, and the honor given to the martyrs, the shaheed, is so great following Uhud, that it is seen as a clear victory. And there are about 60 verses in the Quran, as I said, in the third chapter of the Quran, Surah Al-Imran, where from sort of I think 120, 121 onwards to about 179, 180, where Allah starts it off in translation saying, and remember when you, O Muhammad, left your household in the morning to post the believers at their stations for the battle. So there's a treasure trove of learning we get from that. Some of the sort of core learning that we can get is that the reason for the defeat is actually deviation from Allah and His Messenger. So it was purely a neglect on part of the archers on the mount, the 40 of them, who explicitly who disobeyed the explicit command of the Prophet ﷺ, right? That they were not to leave that spot, right? Until they, even if the vultures are flying, they have to stay there until they get word from the Prophet ﷺ direct. But 40 out of them left their post. They specifically disobeyed the Prophet ﷺ. And up until that point, the Muslims were winning. And Allah says this in the Qur'an, that He had promised the Muslims what was owed to them, and that was the victory, until they disobeyed the Prophet. And the success of us as Muslims depends wholly on our obedience to the Prophet ﷺ and our obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? As long as we carry out what is required from us in the Qur'an and the Sunnah, we will be victorious. Right? We put our full trust in Allah, we will be victorious. Facing all the odds, Allah will have our back. Right? But when we set aside our trust and faith in Allah and Prophet ﷺ for the pursuit of worldly riches, and worldly riches, it's not just financial riches, but fame, fortune, position, nobility, all of these things. If we put those aside, if we put the Islam aside in favour of those things, we're going to lose. We're going to come to grief, and that is one of the clearest lessons, even mentioned in the Qur'an, of the Battle of Uhud. If we want victory, we hold on tight to the rope of Allah. Okay. The other great positive outcome that came from the Battle of Uhud, and we'll talk about this next week inshallah, was it exposed who were the real believers and who were the hypocrites, right? The hypocrites, they exposed their real intention, both in words and deeds. Now the Muslims could see clearly who is on the side of the truth, who is on the side of justice, and who is on the side of the oppressors, who is on the side of evil. Very clear, right? And again, it's at these sort of critical junctures that you sort the wheat from the chaff, and and it was made clear to everyone at this point in time where they stand. Okay, so this is these are really important lessons, and I suppose one of the other key lessons, and I'll try and sort of wrap it up in these next minute or so, is that the putting off victory in some areas, it helps us as individuals check our pride, the pride that we have in our soul, our ruh, and it teaches us these stern, stiff tests. They teach us as Muslims how to observe full patience in times of adversity. Trials and tests, they are put there by Allah in order that a true believer can attain our rightful position in Jannah, in the hereafter. So the harsher the test, and if we approach that with full patience in these times of adversity, Allah is using that as a way to increase our rank, because He loves us that much. And what greater adversity could there have been, as faced by the Muslims on the battlefield on that day, and then linked to that is the status of martyrdom, being shaheed as one of the highest ranks that a true friend of Allah can have, is to be granted shaheed and martyrdom, right? A golden opportunity for the Muslims to be elevated to their true ranks, and we'll explain this more next time, and a way that Allah exposes the hypocrites and the disbelievers, so much so that they can't argue on the Day of Judgment. It's essentially giving them enough rope that they hang themselves, so that they face their ultimate annihilation and destruction because of their disbelief in tyranny and oppression and transgression. So these are some of the wider lessons and moralities that we can learn around obedience to the Prophet ﷺ, and the Qur'an, sorting out the believers and the hypocrites, and teaching us to check our pride, and to be patient in times of adversity, and to reach the levels that are deserved of us. So next time, inshallah, we'll compare Uhud with Badr, and we'll go through some of the verses of the Battle of Uhud that are mentioned in the Qur'an and the lessons related to that. So I'll finish there, inshallah, and just to say the last few days of Ramadan left, still one potential night of power left. So do remember us in your du'as. Do remember Ummah in your du'as. Do make it easy for all of us, and make du'a that Allah allows us to taste the beauty of Ramadan yet again. And as I say, it's quite sort of hot here. It's sort of just touching 40 degrees at the moment. But there are people who are in worse situations than this, and then may Allah make it easy for them. So wishing everyone Eid Mubarak, wishing everyone a blessed Eid, and inshallah catch up with everyone after Eid, inshallah. And do also remember to make the intention to keep the 6 fasts of Shawwal as well. That equates to fasting for the whole year, so it's better to make that intention early in the month rather than later in the month. So finish there, inshallah. So Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. والعصر إن الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر. جزاك الله خير, everybody. Assalamu alaikum.